Imagine standing in front of 200 people, your closest friends, your family, your peers waiting to celebrate your son's college graduation. But instead of a toast, your husband of 18 years takes the microphone, smiles directly at you, and proudly announces to the room that you've spent your entire life raising his mistress's child. He expected me to break. He expected me to cry and run out in disgrace. What he didn't know was that as a military tactician, I had already spent 6 months investigating his lies. And I had just rigged that very ballroom to expose a $2 million federal crime he was willing to destroy my life to hide. He thought he was executing a flawless ambush. He had no idea he was walking straight into a minefield. In this story, you will discover why a woman's silence isn't always submission, sometimes. It's a loaded weapon, and how true family is built on unbreakable honor, not just blood. If you've ever had to fight back against a manipulator, or if you simply believe in the phenomenal power of women taking their power back, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to join a community that refuses to be silenced. In the military, they teach you to anticipate the ambush. You are trained to look for the rustle in the trees, the sudden departure of birds, the unnatural stillness of the air before the chaos inevitably erupts. You learn to trust your instincts when the environment feels just a fraction of a degree off its normal axis. But there are no tactical field manuals for anticipating an ambush in a five-star hotel ballroom, orchestrated by the man who has shared your bed, your life, and your most intimate secrets for 18 years. My name is Eleanor. For over 2 decades, I have proudly worn the uniform of a United States Army colonel. I have commanded battalions in hostile territories, briefed generals under immense pressure, and made split-second decisions that determined whether young soldiers lived or died. I built my entire adult life on the pillars of discipline, acute observation, and unshakable honor. Yet nothing in my extensive tactical training prepared me for the quiet, insidious warfare waged inside the walls of my own home by a man I thought I knew completely. Richard was a high-profile wealth manager when we met, a man whose charisma could warm the coldest room. He was impeccable in his tailored suits, armed with a disarming smile and an endless reservoir of confidence. When we had been dating for only a few months, he sat me down with tears in his eyes and told me a story that shattered my heart. He confessed that he had a 3-month-old son named Julian. According to Richard, Julian's mother, a woman named Clara, had tragically died during childbirth. He painted a picture of himself as a grieving, overwhelmed single father desperately trying to piece his life back together. When I looked at the photograph of that tiny, fragile infant wrapped in a hospital blanket, something deep within my soul simply decided I did not just marry Richard. I committed myself entirely to making sure that little boy would never feel the void of a mother's absence. I adopted Julian before his first birthday, and for 18 years, I poured every ounce of my love, energy, and devotion into raising him into a man of honor. For a long time, the illusion of our perfect family held firm. But looking back, I realized there were hairline fractures in the foundation, tiny inconsistencies that I chose to overlook because examining them felt like a betrayal of my own happiness. Richard was an expert at curating reality. Whenever Julian asked innocent questions about his biological mother, Richard would smoothly and expertly change the subject, citing raw grief that he just could not process. I believed him. But the true nature of his manipulation revealed itself in subtler, more sinister ways. When Julian was 16, he required a routine surgical procedure. While filling out the hospital paperwork, I noticed a significant discrepancy in his blood type records that did not align with what Richard had always told me. When I gently questioned my husband about it, he did not just brush it off. He hired a private medical consultant to sit in our living room and expertly explain away the discrepancy as a historical clerical error. He manufactured an entire alternate reality just to make me doubt my own eyes. That is the insidious nature of emotional abuse. It strips away your fundamental human right to trust your own mind, replacing your reality with their fiction. The defining fracture, however, occurred exactly 6 months before Julian's college graduation. It was a mundane Tuesday afternoon when I intercepted a piece of mail that had been misdelivered to our home address instead of Richard's private downtown office. It was a heavy, official-looking envelope containing tax documents for an offshore shell corporation I had never heard of. As I scanned the pages, my blood ran cold. There, on the final page of the document, was my signature. It was a masterful forgery, close enough to pass a casual glance. But to a woman trained to analyze intelligence reports and spot deviations, it was a glaring, undeniable fake. In that solitary moment standing in my kitchen, the scales fell from my eyes. I realized that my husband was not just secretive. He was actively committing federal fraud using my identity. A lesser woman might have confronted him right then, screaming and throwing the documents in his face. But I am not a lesser woman. I am a soldier. I carefully folded the document, placed it back in my briefcase, and decided in that exact moment to go to war. The first rule of surviving a catastrophic betrayal is to secure your emotional perimeter. I knew that if I confronted Richard with a single piece of evidence, his silver tongue would spin a web of plausible deniability, and he would immediately move to hide the rest of his sins. So, I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I maintained the facade. I continued to pour his morning coffee. I smiled at him across the dinner table, and I asked about his day, all while silently initiating the most critical covert operation of my career. Within 48 hours of discovering the forged document, I had retained the services of a ruthless independent forensic accountant and a discreet private investigator. I gave them access to everything I could quietly copy or photograph without triggering Richard's suspicions. For months, I lived a double life, playing the devoted, unsuspecting wife by day, and reviewing damning financial and investigative reports in the dead of night. The financial betrayal was staggering, but it was only the first layer of the rot. The forensic accountant traced a labyrinth of hidden accounts, shell companies, and unauthorized credit lines. But the detail that brought me to my knees was the discovery of where the money was actually going. Richard had not just forged my signature on business documents. He had systematically siphoned over $2 million from Julian's college education trust fund. This was money I had saved from my combat pay, carefully invested to ensure my son's future was secure. Richard had bled it dry to cover massive, hidden gambling debts and catastrophic losses in underground investments. He had stolen from his own son to feed his ego and his addictions. The sheer audacity of his greed was sickening. But as horrific as the financial crimes were, they paled in comparison to the human cost of his deception, which the private investigator was about to lay bare on my desk. It arrived in a plain manila envelope 3 weeks before the graduation ceremony. The investigator had looked into the death certificate of Clara, Julian's biological mother. He found absolutely nothing. There was no death certificate because Clara had never died. She was alive, living a quiet, fearful life 3 states away. When the investigator carefully approached her, the true horror of Richard's character was finally exposed. 22 years ago, Clara had not abandoned her baby because she was careless or unloving. She had been a vulnerable, terrified young woman who was violently coerced. Richard had used his immense wealth, his high-powered legal connections, and psychological terror to threaten her. He told her that if she did not disappear and leave the child with him, he would destroy her life, ensure she was imprisoned, and make sure she never saw the light of day again. He stole a child from its mother and then buried that mother alive under a mountain of fear. My heart did not break for myself in that moment. It shattered for the young woman who had been robbed of her fundamental right to watch her son grow. As I sat in my study reading the transcript of Clara's interview, my grief crystallized into something cold, hard, and unstoppable. I realized that Richard's recent erratic behavior and sudden insistence on making a grand speech at Julian's upcoming graduation dinner was not a coincidence. He knew the walls were closing in. He had caught wind that auditors were asking questions. His plan was a preemptive strike. He intended to stand up at the dinner, publicly confess to an ancient affair, and humiliate me in front of our entire community. He wanted to frame the narrative, painting me as a scorned, vindictive wife, so that when the financial fraud inevitably came to light, he could dismiss my accusations as the hysterical revenge of a jealous woman. He thought he was playing chess against a pawn. But on the morning of Julian's graduation, as I meticulously ironed my dress uniform and pinned my medals to my chest, I felt a profound sense of calm. I slipped a silver USB drive containing every shred of evidence into my pocket. Richard thought he was walking into a ballroom to execute a flawless ambush. He had no idea he was walking straight into a minefield. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was a masterclass in opulent intimidation, drenched in the warm, golden light of crystal chandeliers and smelling faintly of expensive orchids and vintage champagne. It was a space designed for the celebration of success, filled with 200 of our closest friends, family members, and Richard's high net worth colleagues. I sat at the head table in my immaculate dress uniform, the medals on my chest catching the light, projecting the absolute calm of a commanding officer. Beside me sat Julian, looking impossibly handsome and grown up in his tailored suit, his eyes shining with the innocent pride of a young man who believed his family was gathered solely to celebrate his university graduation. Across from us, Richard was holding court. He had a glass of scotch in one hand, working the room with his signature predatory charm, laughing loudly and clapping men on the shoulder. To the untrained eye, he was the picture of a proud patriarch. But I watched him with the clinical detachment of a sniper looking through a scope. I saw the slight tremor in his fingers when he set his glass down. I noted the frantic, sweeping glances he cast toward the heavy oak doors, waiting for a threat he knew was coming. The forensic auditors had frozen his primary accounts that very morning. I knew his time was up, and he knew it too. This dinner was his desperate, final maneuver. When the waiters began clearing the dessert plates, Richard stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The sharp, high ringing sliced through the low hum of conversation, and the ballroom gradually fell into an expectant hush. He walked slowly toward the small stage set up for the evening's toasts, taking the microphone from the stand with a practiced ease. He looked out over the crowd, letting the silence stretch, building the theatrical tension he thrived on. Then he looked directly at me. His smile was chillingly hollow, devoid of any genuine warmth, masking a desperate cruelty. He began with a few platitudes about how fast time flies, how proud he was of Julian, and how much sacrifice parenting requires. The audience nodded along, captivated by his charisma, and then he dropped the facade. His voice took on a tone of mocking reverence as he raised his glass in my direction. "Everyone in this room should raise a glass to Eleanor," he said, his voice echoing loudly through the sound system. "She is a woman of incredible dedication. After all, she spent the last 18 years raising my mistress's son without asking a single question, for 3 agonizing seconds." The ballroom was suspended in a vacuum of utter shock. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents near the ceiling. I watched the expressions on the faces of our guests shift from polite smiles to horrified confusion, and finally, to a profound, suffocating pity directed entirely at me. Richard stood on the stage, smirking, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. He expected me to shatter. He expected the humiliated, weeping wife to flee the room in disgrace, providing him with the perfect narrative. He wanted everyone to remember me as the unstable, scorned woman, so that when the FBI arrived the next day, my accusations of financial fraud would sound like the hysterical lies of a broken heart. He thought he had successfully ambushed me. He thought my silence was the paralysis of a victim. He was entirely wrong. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flinch. And I certainly did not run. I stood up slowly, my posture impeccably straight, drawing on decades of military discipline. Every eye in the room was fixed on me as I walked deliberately away from the head table, but I did not walk toward the exit. I walked to the back of the ballroom, directly to the audio-visual control desk. The young technician sitting there looked up at me with wide, panicked eyes. Without a word, I reached into my pocket, withdrew the encrypted silver USB drive, and plugged it directly into his console. I leaned over the soundboard, tapped a few keys, and hijacked the primary feed. Behind Richard, the massive projector screen, which had been displaying a rotating slideshow of Julian's childhood photos, suddenly went black. A moment later, it illuminated the room with the harsh, undeniable glare of truth. High-resolution scans of offshore bank statements, Shell Corporation tax filings, and the blatant forgeries of my signature on Julian's depleted college trust fund materialized in massive, glowing text for 200 people to see. I picked up the spare microphone from the technician's desk. My voice was steady, calm, and utterly lethal. "Richard," I said, my voice resonating across the stunned room. "You are not confessing to an ancient affair to clear your conscience. You are attempting to control the narrative before federal authorities arrest you for embezzling $2 million from your own son's future. But a soldier never walks into a battlefield blind, and you have vastly underestimated the woman you tried to destroy." The color drained from Richard's face so rapidly he looked as though he might collapse on the stage. The smug, victorious smirk vanished, replaced by the wild, cornered look of a man who suddenly realizes the trap has sprung on him, not his prey. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted violently. The suffocating pity the guests had felt for me instantly evaporated, replaced by a palpable, collective disgust aimed squarely at the man on the stage. Whispers erupted across the tables as high-powered executives and old friends read the undeniable evidence of fraud glaring from the screen. Richard scrambled, his survival instincts kicking in. He gripped the microphone, his hands now visibly shaking, and turned his desperate gaze toward Julian. "Julian, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking as he tried to play his final, pathetic card. "I did what I had to do. I made mistakes. But I did it to keep our family together. Your real mother didn't want you. She abandoned you. I was the only one who stayed to protect you." He expected Julian to break, to succumb to the emotional manipulation that had governed our household for nearly 2 decades. But my son did not look betrayed or confused. He looked incredibly resolute, carrying a quiet strength that mirrored my own. Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a chilling calmness. He did not look at his father. Instead, he looked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, right on cue. The doors swung open. The room fell dead silent once more as a woman stepped inside. She was trembling slightly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, but she held her head high. It was Clara. Julian had not been idle while I conducted my covert investigation. With the help of my private investigator, he had reached out to the woman whose life Richard had stolen. He walked down the aisle, took Clara gently by the arm, and escorted her toward the front of the room. Richard let out a choked, breathless sound, stepping back as if he had seen a ghost. Julian took the microphone from my hand, his eyes locked on his father. "She didn't abandon me," Julian said, his voice steady and echoing with undeniable authority. "You threatened to ruin her. You used your money and your lawyers to terrify a 22-year-old girl into disappearing, stealing her right to be a mother just to protect your own reputation." Julian then turned away from the man who shared his DNA and looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with a fierce, protective devotion that transcended any biological connection. "And as for my real mother," Julian continued, his voice softening but projecting clearly to every corner of the room, "the Colonel raised me. She didn't just give me a home. She taught me what honor actually means. She taught me about respect, equality, and human dignity. You didn't teach me how to be a man, Richard. You only taught me exactly what I never want to become. It was the ultimate, decisive blow. Richard dropped the microphone, the feedback squealing through the speakers, and walked out of the ballroom in utter, irredeemable disgrace, leaving his entire life in ruins behind him. The fallout was swift and absolute. Within 48 hours, the FBI executed search warrants at Richard's firm, and he was indicted on multiple counts of federal fraud and identity theft. His reputation was incinerated, his assets seized, and he faced years in federal prison. But this story is not about his destruction. It is about our reconstruction. In the weeks that followed, Clara and I did not behave like rivals fighting over a piece of history. We sat together in my kitchen, drinking coffee, sharing our grief, and forging an unlikely but profound bond. I saw her not as a threat, but as a fellow survivor of a man who believed he had the right to play God with women's lives. We agreed that women must elevate one another, not tear each other down over the sins of a narcissistic man. Julian took his rightful place in the world, inspired by the ordeal to pursue a career in cybersecurity, dedicating his brilliant mind to protecting vulnerable populations from financial abuse. If there is a lesson to be extracted from the wreckage of those 18 years, it is this. We are so often taught as women to smooth things over, to ignore the glaring red flags in order to keep the peace in our homes. But a peace built upon a foundation of lies and gaslighting is merely a war waiting to ignite. True family is never just about biology. It is forged in the fires of mutual respect, unyielding support, and human dignity. Richard believed that his status gave him the inherent right to manipulate, erase, and control the women in his life. But he fundamentally underestimated the ferocious strength of a mother and the unbreakable loyalty of a child raised with true compassion. Healing does not mean forgetting the trauma you endured. It means taking those shattered pieces of your past and forging them into impenetrable armor. It means standing relentlessly in your own truth, demanding your basic human right to be respected, and never, ever allowing anyone else to hold the microphone and dictate the reality of your life. The sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of the federal courthouse was a stark departure from the gilded opulence of the St. Regis Ballroom. But to me, it felt like a battlefield where the final, decisive engagement of this war would be fought. The trial of Richard began exactly 11 months after the graduation dinner, and the air inside the courtroom was heavy with the weight of impending justice. For 18 years, Richard had operated in the shadows of our marriage, utilizing his charisma and societal status as an impenetrable shield against accountability. But in the cold, unyielding light of a federal courtroom, charisma is utterly useless against the crushing weight of verified forensic evidence. The prosecution's case was built on the meticulous records I had gathered, a mountain of financial documents that detailed a staggering pattern of embezzlement, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Sitting in the gallery, dressed in a sharp civilian suit, I watched as the man who had once dictated my reality was reduced to a defendant sitting at a wooden table, his designer suits looking suddenly oversized, his arrogant posture slowly deteriorating as the prosecution dismantled his life piece by piece. When it was my turn to take the stand, I did not walk up to the witness box as a victim seeking pity. I walked up as a United States Army colonel providing a tactical briefing. The defense attorney, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Sterling, attempted to weaponize my military background against me. He tried to paint me as a cold, calculating woman who had orchestrated this entire public downfall out of spite over a failing marriage. He questioned my capacity for empathy, insinuating that I had neglected my husband emotionally, which supposedly drove him to make desperate financial decisions to maintain our lifestyle. I listened to his narrative without breaking eye contact. When he finally paused, I leaned into the microphone and explained the insidious mechanics of financial and emotional abuse. I detailed exactly how Richard had forged my signature on Julian's education trust fund, stripping away our financial autonomy to fund his illicit gambling habits. I explained to the jury that gaslighting is not merely a marital disagreement, It is a systematic dismantling of a person's psychological independence, a fundamental violation of human rights that traps women in a manufactured reality. The courtroom was silent as I spoke, the jury hanging on every measured word, recognizing the unvarnished truth of a woman who had refused to be erased. However, the most profound moment of the trial did not belong to me. It belonged to Clara. When the prosecution called her to the stand, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard refused to look at her, staring fixedly at his hands. Clara had spent 22 years living in the terrifying shadow of Richard's threats, but as she sat in the witness box, she possessed a quiet, radiant courage. She testified about the coercion she endured as a young, vulnerable woman. She detailed how Richard, leveraging his immense wealth and legal connections, had threatened to fabricate drug charges against her if she did not surrender her parental rights and vanish completely. She spoke passionately about the right of a mother to love her child, and how that sacred human right had been violently stolen from her by a man who viewed people merely as assets to be managed and controlled. Her testimony was not just a legal indictment. It was a profound educational moment for everyone in that room about the invisible, destructive power dynamics that often exist between wealthy men and marginalized women. When the jury returned their verdict after only 4 hours of deliberation, finding Richard guilty on all federal charges, there was no dramatic celebration. There was only the heavy, satisfying sound of the judge's gavel, signaling that the architecture of Richard's deceit had finally been demolished, and that justice, though delayed by decades, had finally arrived. A year after the federal trial concluded, the suffocating atmosphere that had once defined my life was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, breathing sense of peace. Healing from 2 decades of manipulation is not a linear journey. It does not happen overnight, and it requires the conscious, daily effort to rebuild your emotional foundation from the ground up. I sold the massive, hollow house I had shared with Richard and purchased a beautiful, sunlit property on the edge of the city, a space that I filled exclusively with truth, light, and the people who genuinely mattered. Julian, inspired by the harrowing revelation of his father's financial crimes, had thrown himself into his career in cybersecurity. He was now leading a specialized task force dedicated to developing algorithms that detect patterns of financial coercion in joint bank accounts, actively working to protect vulnerable populations from the exact type of invisible abuse that had almost destroyed our family. He had taken the darkest chapter of his life and transmuted it into a powerful tool for social justice, proving that true character is forged in how we respond to the fires that attempt to consume us. The most beautiful and unexpected outcome of this entire ordeal, however, was the evolution of my relationship with Clara. Society often dictates that the biological mother and the adoptive mother must exist in a state of perpetual rivalry, competing for the affection and loyalty of the child. We completely shattered that archaic, patriarchal narrative. Clara and I became the closest of friends, bonded by our shared survival and our mutual, unconditional love for Julian. We began hosting Sunday dinners together at my new home. To see Julian sitting at the dining table, laughing and sharing stories with both the woman who gave him life and the woman who taught him how to live it, was a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. We taught him, through our unity, that family is not a zero-sum game. Love does not divide, it multiplies. By refusing to let Richard's cruelty dictate our relationship, Clara and I reclaimed our autonomy and demonstrated that women united in truth are an unstoppable force, capable of rewriting the very definition of family. If you have watched this story unfold, and you recognize fragments of your own life in my words, I want to leave you with a vital message. We are taught to endure, to suffer in silence to maintain the facade of a perfect life. But silence is the soil in which abuse thrives. Your human dignity, your right to equality in a partnership, and your right to live a life free from psychological manipulation are not privileges. They are absolute necessities. Do not ignore the financial discrepancies. Do not brush away the lies. And never let anyone convince you that your intuition is merely paranoia. It is terrifying to step into the unknown and confront the person who has held power over you. But the freedom that waits on the other side of that confrontation is worth every tear. You are stronger than the lies you have been told. I urge you to share your experiences in the comments below, to subscribe to this channel, and to join a community of survivors who refuse to be victims. Thank you for listening. Thank you for standing with me. And remember, never be afraid to take the microphone back. Keep your head high. Protect your truth. And I will see you in the next chapter. The concept of legacy is something we spent our entire lives trying to understand, often mistaking it for the wealth we accumulate or the bloodlines we leave behind. But true legacy is not inherited. It is enacted. It is the undeniable ripple effect of the choices we make when our backs are against the wall. For Julian, the legacy he chose to inherit was not the deceit and cowardice of his biological father, but the tactical resilience and unwavering honor he learned from the woman who raised him. 2 years after the gavel fell in that federal courtroom, Julian's cybersecurity firm, Vanguard Shield, had become a formidable force in the fight against financial abuse. He did not merely build software. He engineered digital rescue missions. He assembled a team of forensic accountants, former law enforcement analysts, and white hat hackers dedicated entirely to uncovering the hidden assets of high net worth individuals who used their wealth to terrorize their partners. I often visited him at his downtown office, a sleek, humming epicenter of servers and encrypted monitors. And watching him work was like watching a master strategist survey a complex battlefield. He had taken the agonizing vulnerability of his own past and weaponized it into a shield for others. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I sat in the corner of his office, nursing a cup of black coffee, while Julian briefed his team on a particularly harrowing case. The target was a prominent local surgeon who had spent a decade systematically draining his wife's inheritance, funneling the money into offshore accounts while convincing her she was losing her mind. Listening to Julian outline the extraction strategy, I was struck by the chilling parallels to my own history with Richard. But what filled me with an overwhelming, incandescent pride was Julian's approach. He did not speak about the victims with pity. He spoke about them with a profound, fierce respect for their human dignity. He understood that these women were not weak. They were simply operating blindly in a war zone created by the men they trusted. After the briefing, Julian sat across from me, the blue light of his monitors reflecting in his eyes. He told me that every time he cracked a hidden ledger, every time he handed a woman the unassailable proof of her partner's financial crimes, he felt like he was reaching back in time and saving Clara. He was dismantling the very architecture of abuse that had once been used to erase his biological mother. We talked about Richard that afternoon, not with the lingering bitterness of victims, but with the cold, analytical detachment of survivors who had studied their enemy and won. Richard was serving a 15-year sentence in a federal correctional institution, stripped of his tailored suits, his country club memberships, and his carefully curated audience. His wealth had been seized, repurposed to pay restitution to the clients and family members he had defrauded. Julian told me that Richard had tried to reach out to him a few months prior, sending a long, manipulative letter full of empty apologies and veiled demands for sympathy. I asked Julian how he responded, anticipating that he might have felt a flicker of conflict. Julian simply smiled, a quiet, resolute expression that mirrored my own. He said he hadn't responded at all. He had run the letter through a shredder. He explained that a man who demands respect without ever offering it is a man who deserves nothing but absolute silence. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the cycle of trauma had been permanently broken. Richard's cruelty had failed to infect the next generation. Instead, it had catalyzed the creation of a man who would spend his life ensuring that the fundamental human rights of equality, financial autonomy, and psychological safety were protected for those who could not fight for themselves. The culmination of our journey from victims of deceit to architects of our own destiny was realized not in a courtroom, but in a brightly lit community center on a crisp autumn evening. Clara and I had spent the past year establishing a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing emergency legal and financial resources to women escaping domestic financial abuse. We called it the Vanguard Foundation, a civilian extension of Julian's corporate work. Entirely funded by the restitution money we had recovered from Richard's seized estate. We were hosting our inaugural fundraising gala, and the room was filled with women who had survived the unimaginable, their faces glowing with the hard-won radiance of reclaimed autonomy. There were no crystal chandeliers or vintage champagnes like there had been at the St. Regis, but the air was charged with something infinitely more valuable, absolute, undeniable truth. I stood near the back of the room, watching the attendees connect, share their stories, and realize that they were no longer isolated in the dark. The most profound moment of the night arrived when Clara took the stage to deliver the keynote address. The woman who walked up to that podium was unrecognizable from the terrified, voiceless girl Richard had threatened into submission 24 years ago. She wore a stunning emerald dress, her head held high, projecting an aura of quiet, unshakable strength. She grasped the edges of the podium, looked out at the audience, and told her story without a single tremor in her voice. She spoke about the devastating pain of being erased, the agony of watching her son grow up from a distance, and the terrifying power of wealthy men who believe they can purchase a woman's silence. But then, her voice swelled with power as she shifted the narrative. She spoke about the unbreakable solidarity of women. She looked directly at me across the crowded room and declared that the greatest victory of her life was not just finding her son, but finding a sister in the woman who had raised him. She told the audience that when women stop competing for the approval of toxic men and start fighting for each other's basic human rights, the patriarchy loses its most potent weapon. The applause that followed was deafening, a standing ovation born not of polite obligation, but of deep, visceral recognition. As I stood there clapping for my friend, my co-parent, and my sister in arms, I felt the final, lingering shadows of the past dissolve completely. I thought about the military oath I had taken decades ago to support and defend the Constitution, to protect the vulnerable, and to serve with honor. I realized that my most important deployment had not been overseas. It had been inside my own home, fighting to protect the psychological borders of my family from a domestic enemy. If you are watching this, and you are currently standing in the wreckage of a shattered marriage, wondering if the pain will ever subside, hear me now. The humiliation they try to force upon you is not yours to carry. It belongs entirely to them. You are not broken. You are merely in the grueling process of being reshaped into a weapon of absolute truth. Do not let them silence you. Do not let them control the narrative of your life. Gather your evidence, find your allies, and when the moment is right, take the microphone and tell the world exactly who they are. Thank you for walking this incredible journey of healing and justice with me. Please continue to share your stories in the comments, subscribe to our community, and always remember, your life is your own command. Dismissed. In the military, they teach you that the true test of a commander is not how they handle the chaos of an active firefight, but how they navigate the deafening silence that follows the extraction. For a long time after Richard's conviction, I waited for the adrenaline to fade, expecting the hypervigilance of the past 2 decades to finally release its grip on my nervous system. But when you have survived a clandestine war within the walls of your own home, you do not simply retire your armor. You reforge it. The Vanguard Foundation, the nonprofit Clara and I had built from the ashes of Richard's seized estate, quickly evolved from a grassroots support group into a formidable, nationwide sanctuary for women escaping high-net-worth financial abuse. We became a beacon for those who were trapped in gilded cages, women whose abusers used sophisticated investment portfolios, offshore trusts, and relentless gaslighting as weapons of domestic terror. our headquarters. A beautifully restored brick building in the heart of the city, operated with the precision of a military command center and the warmth of a true sanctuary. We were no longer just surviving. We were actively hunting the very architecture of patriarchal abuse. The true magnitude of our mission crystallized on a freezing Tuesday morning when a woman named Victoria walked through our reinforced glass doors. Victoria was a woman the public thought they knew intimately. She was the elegant, impeccably styled wife of a prominent state senator, a man whose political platform was built entirely on the sanctity of family values and moral integrity. To the outside world, she lived a life of absolute privilege, photographed smiling at charity galas and cutting ribbons at children's hospitals. But the woman who sat shivering in my private office, clutching a cup of tea with trembling hands, was a ghost of her public persona. Through tears of profound exhaustion, Victoria detailed a reality that was chillingly familiar to me. Her husband had spent the last 12 years systematically isolating her, transferring every asset, including her own family inheritance, into blind trusts she could not legally access. He monitored her communications, dictated her movements, and routinely threatened to have her involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility if she ever dared to expose the reality of their marriage. He was using his political hegemony and wealth to execute a flawless campaign of psychological annihilation. Listening to Victoria, I felt the familiar, icy calm of a soldier analyzing a high-stakes tactical objective. I did not offer her empty platitudes or tell her that everything would magically be all right. Instead, I offered her a strategy. I called Julian, who immediately mobilized the elite forensic analysts at Vanguard Shield. Within hours, his cybersecurity team was quietly mapping the digital footprint of the senator's hidden empire, tracing the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to keep Victoria entirely dependent and paralyzed by fear. Julian operated with a fierce, quiet intensity, treating Victoria's extraction not just as a professional obligation, but as a deeply personal crusade. Watching my son direct his team of white hat hackers and financial investigators, I saw the culmination of every lesson in honor and duty I had ever taught him. He was dismantling the senator's impenetrable fortress bite by bite, searching for the single financial discrepancy that would blow the doors off the hinges and set this woman free. While Julian handled the digital warfare, Clara focused on the emotional front lines. Clara possessed a unique, irreplaceable empathy born from having survived the ultimate erasure. She sat with Victoria for hours in our sunlit counseling rooms, sharing her own harrowing story of being threatened into silence by a powerful, wealthy man 24 years ago. Clara taught Victoria how to breathe through the suffocating panic attacks, how to recognize the mechanics of gaslighting, and how to slowly reclaim the fragments of her shattered identity. The three of us formed an unbreakable trinity. I provided the tactical framework. Julian delivered the definitive proof, and Clara administered the profound emotional healing. We were showing Victoria that the immense power her husband wielded was nothing more than an elaborate illusion, a house of cards waiting for a single gust of truth to bring it crashing down. We were preparing to execute a rescue mission that would not only save one woman's life, but would send a shockwave through the corridors of power, proving that no amount of money or political influence could withstand the righteous fury of women united. The extraction of Victoria was executed with a level of precision that would have made a 4-star general proud. We did not confront the senator in a dramatic, emotional showdown behind closed doors, where he could leverage his manipulation tactics to twist the narrative. Instead, we orchestrated a simultaneous, multi-front offensive. On the morning of his highly publicized re-election campaign launch, while he was standing at a podium delivering a speech about transparency and family values, Vanguard Shield securely transmitted a comprehensive, encrypted dossier to 3 major investigative journalism outlets and the Federal Election Commission. The dossier contained undeniable proof of his offshore embezzlement, illicit campaign financing, and the fraudulent trusts he had weaponized against his wife. Simultaneously, a team of specialized private security contractors, funded by the Foundation, safely relocated Victoria to a secure, undisclosed property hundreds of miles away. By the time the senator stepped off the stage, his political career was effectively incinerated. His assets were frozen pending federal investigation, and his primary victim was entirely out of his reach. Watching the breaking news coverage on the monitors in the Foundation's command center, a profound sense of closure washed over me. The anchors were scrambling to detail the catastrophic fall of a political titan. Reading directly from the forensic reports Julian had meticulously compiled, Clara stood beside me, her hand resting warmly on my shoulder, while Julian watched from the doorway with a quiet, satisfied smile. We had done it. We had taken the horrific abuse we had suffered at the hands of Richard and forged it into a specialized weapon of mass liberation. The Vanguard Foundation was no longer just a reactionary support group. It was an active deterrent. We were sending a definitive, uncompromising message to every narcissistic, high net worth abuser who believed their wealth granted them immunity. Your money cannot hide you. Your threats will not silence us. And there is an army of survivors waiting in the dark to dismantle your empire. We had fundamentally shifted the balance of power, reclaiming the narrative not just for ourselves, but for thousands of women who had been told their voices did not matter. Later that evening, the three of us gathered at my home for a quiet celebratory dinner. The house was filled with the warm, golden light of the setting sun, the smell of roasted garlic, and the sound of genuine, unburdened laughter. Julian brought along his fiancée, a brilliant, fiercely independent civil rights attorney who fit into our unconventional family with effortless grace. Looking around the table at the people I loved most in the world, I realized that this was the ultimate victory. Richard had tried to destroy me by exposing a secret he thought would shatter my reality. He believed that blood and biology were the only legitimate currencies of family. But sitting there, looking at Clara, the woman who gave my son life, and Julian, the magnificent man I had the privilege of raising, I knew the absolute truth. Family is a conscious, daily choice. It is the sanctuary you build with the people who respect your dignity, honor your boundaries, and stand beside you when the world attempts to break you. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, I want you to internalize this final, undeniable truth. The trauma you have endured at the hands of a toxic, manipulative partner does not define your future. It is merely the crucible in which your ultimate strength is forged. You have the absolute right to demand equality, to interrogate the inconsistencies in your life, and to walk away from any table where respect is no longer being served. Do not wait for a savior to hand you the microphone. Reach out. Take it and speak your truth with a voice so loud it shakes the very foundations of their deceit. Thank you for listening, for sharing your incredible stories of survival in the comments, and for being part of this empowering community. Please subscribe. Continue to lift each other up, and never forget the phenomenal power you hold. The war may be exhausting, but the peace you build on the other side is incredibly, beautifully yours. As we close this chapter, I want to leave you with a reflection that extends far beyond the walls of that graduation ballroom. We are so frequently conditioned by society to believe that keeping the peace in our homes is our ultimate duty as women, even if maintaining that peace requires us to swallow our intuition and endure quiet, daily disrespect. But a peace built on a foundation of gaslighting, financial control, and manipulation isn't peace at all. It is a prison. Richard believed that his wealth and societal status granted him the absolute right to rewrite reality. He believed he could erase a young, vulnerable mother out of existence with threats, and he believed he could weaponize my dedication to blind me to his massive financial crimes. But he made a fatal miscalculation. He underestimated the most formidable force on earth, the fierce, protective intuition of a mother, and the unbreakable solidarity of women who refuse to be pitted against one another. This story is a living testament to the fact that family is not strictly defined by the DNA we share. Family is the conscious, deliberate, and daily choice to show up, to protect one another, and to honor each other's basic human dignity. Julian did not owe his loyalty to the man who provided his genetics. He gave his unwavering loyalty to the woman who gave him her heart and taught him the true meaning of honor. If you are currently trapped in a dynamic where your reality is constantly being questioned, where your financial autonomy is restricted, or where you are made to feel small just so your partner can feel powerful, let this be your wake-up call. You are not paranoid. You are not crazy. And you are certainly not alone. Your intuition is your greatest tactical weapon. Do not be afraid to investigate the inconsistencies in your life. Do not be afraid to gather your evidence in silence. And when the time is right, do not be afraid to take the microphone and reclaim the narrative of your own life. You have a fundamental human right to a life free of manipulation. You have the right to the truth. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video. This content has been researched, developed, and edited manually by us to deliver meaningful lessons.